Okay, everybody. Welcome to part two of my every Awaker explained tier list. I don't know how to describe it, but basically it is part two of me explaining the kits of every Awaker, and today we are doing Chaos. And like last time, we are going to start with the standards and then move on to the welfares and into the limiteds finally. Funnily enough, Chaos is unique. Instead of having a Pearl welfare, they have investigation badge welfares, which I will explain the nuances of such more so when we get into it. But for now, yes, lead on the starter character that everyone has, Ramona. And I'm going to start on Ramona first because she is a bit unique in application or acquisition, I should say, because you just get her as your account progresses. So you notice mine is at plus 11 because once you get her up to account level 80, that's when she is maxed out enlightenment wise. So because she is unique in her just say pull and her draw, whatever, that's where we're gonna start with her. And so with that being the case, you don't really worry too much about the Enlightens, because by the time you unlock any Enlighten, it's probably the good one, right? Because these effects are all great to have on her, but you will be getting them very early on in your experience. So the question only becomes now, what do they actually do? And so Ramona is simply just a like draw and key flare bot. If you have played with her, you've basically noticed that. Her Assault Thesis, her 2-cost card, it reduces the damage you're taking for a turn and then also draws a card and generates key flare. Her Queen Sword, you discard it and it generates key flare uh, equal to its cost. And then her ult, her X ult, it looks into your deck and you grab a card with it. And so her entire thing is basically just draw and keyframe generation. Even her Rouse is simply allows you to play her cards at a quote unquote discount. For the strikes and defense is basically free because it refunds an Aerith whenever you play one of her cards, at least the first 3 per turn. And this way you're able to generate more key flare for your team. So, I mean, that's really all to say about her. If you have a team that really wants to like draw a specific card, like a 24 team or a budget caster or budget to wheel, like any real budget team really wants her, a Dorsane, like she's just a solid support overall. Now, there is also G Ramona, who I will get into when I discuss the welfares, because she is a bit more unique in her application and kit. But that is base Ramona for you. And so next we're gonna look at Karen, just because she is next on my list of Awakers, obviously. And Karen is very simple, right? She has all these cool enlightens, none of them matter. She has all these like cool skill cards, none of these matter. The only reason you're putting this character on a team is to exalt with her. Because her exalt does one thing. It puts a card in hand that gives you +3 Aerith when played. It's +1 Aerith and you can play it 3 times. So it's effectively +3 Aerith. That is it. She exists to give you +3 Aerith, basically, for characters like Tawil or Kath who really just want to spend a lot of Aerith per turn. The only other utility she provides to your team is the Toadstool, because it is 1 turn of weakness occasionally. That can be very helpful. Other than that, all you really need to know about this character is that if you have her Silent Fealty, you should probably play it, because it only ever gets more expensive, and the heal and shielding is less relevant than just having a cheap card. Which brings us to Nymph. And Nymph's a bit of an interesting character because she really isn't powerful at all. You'll see, when I'm like describing some of these character kits, a lot of the time I'm talking about what is their end game or like late game utility, or even just mid game utility. Nymph is one of these characters because early game doesn't really matter. So you just run whatever to just get push yourself through that, and then once you're over that hump, once you start hitting walls or more difficult content like Chapter 7 and stuff, that is when these types of synergies, these types of kit mechanics, that's when these types. I expect players to be watching these types of videos basically. Is around chapters 5, 6, 7 where you've been like introduced to the game and you're trying to get a better understanding of what characters do, what how kits perform, and etc. And so before then, Nymph is solid because she just is a poison DPS. But after then, she really doesn't do a lot, right? You look at this, and all this does is increase her poison application after she exalts. This is just increased poison damage, basically. This is increased poison. And so if you want her as a DPS, you are going to want her at least at E3, and you probably want to get her all the way up to Overexalt, because with Overexalt, you're also increasing poison effect. But generally speaking, you just don't really get up to that. She really only exists for this line of text, is and trigger 100% of poison on all enemies. That is really the only major effect of hers besides like applying weakness and vuln, right? Applying weakness and vuln, always good. At a 3 cost, it's very expensive, but you know. Karen is different. Karen's has prepare, which means it gets cost reduced, but yeah, very expensive. And so, but if you do want to make her into a poison DPS, like feel free to go for it. She is a standard unit, which means it is pretty reasonable. And if you are going to, make sure you get these cards upgraded and get that Overexalt. I genuinely believe you are going to need that Overexalt for damage. I just fear you're going to find yourself disappointed. Then we have Nadala, who is in compared to Nymph in a lot of similar aspects. She's really strong early game, but then she kind of falls off late game, and that's just the nature of a lot of these characters, especially counter characters. Counter is a stat that really falls off in late game content. But basically, what she does is that she gains shield on all her effects. So her rouse is very important for her because it increases her shields as well as increases her counter. But like I said, the counter isn't really that relevant. And then she has these no trespassing, which is shield and temp counter, and the short term memory, which is even more shield and giving alien mist. So the giving alien mist is nice, but she really is just here as like this extra shielder on her team. And you really want her at E3. This Enlighten 3 actually gives Nautilus a lot of power and makes her into somewhat of an endgame unit. Because it's when she exalts, you become immune to basically all debuffs for a turn. There are debuffs that can be applied to you, like Blighton and stuff, but those debuffs really don't exist. They don't really matter. The main debuffs in this game are Fragile, Weakness, and Vuln, and she makes you immune to all of them for a turn. You also do want her at E2 generally as well, just to put her 3 costs to have Prepare. Prepare being the mechanic that makes your stuff cheaper every turn. And the E1 doesn't really matter, but those other two are very important. And so that's why you'll see Nautilus a lot in like later game content. It is mostly because of her Exalt, which makes you immune to debuffs for a turn, and it's especially important for fights like the Chapter 8 and 9 bosses, I believe. Definitely Chapter 9. I can't say for certain about Chapter 8. But not if you have an E3 Nautilus, it can be very, very easy to get through those fights. And so now we have Pandia. And you'll notice I don't use Pandia at all, because she's a very weak character generally. And she's a counter DPS. But her real utility is in this card, the Wax Halt Desire, because it removes all enemies' counter. So if you're playing this character, it's most likely because you're going against like one of the 4 fights in the game where the enemies have counter, and you can just cleanse that right away. That is the main utility people use for this character. If you want, she can also be somewhat of a DPS. I can't recommend it, but if you do want her to be a DPS, you at least need to get her up to E3, because it increases a lot of her damage when she's at that point. Like the gaining alienness on her card is obviously going to be very important. These two getting more damage is very important, obviously, but this is the biggest. Doubling your base damage and getting bonus counter is very good for a counter-based DPS. And that's when you're going to be using cards like the Whip of Madness and her Rouse. But really, her big thing is just stealing counter from bosses, from enemies like Coom, from enemies like N, from Kaikus, all of them. That if you're struggling against those types of mobs in particular, that is the only reason you're going to have Pandia, really. Realistically speaking. And so we have Alva, who's another DPS. She is a Warden DPS, which means her whole idea is that you get her to have high shield, and then it does high damage. And you'll notice she has zero investment on my teams, because this character is literally useless, power crept, like, you just don't play Alva, basically. There is one Alva player in this game who had her, like, plus 12 and loved playing Alva. That person quit the game, like, a couple months ago. That person didn't even make it to this game's second anniversary. Alva is just that weak. If you really want to make Alva work, you at least need to have this OE, because then you're getting a lot more both damage and her cards that provide damage. But just trust me when I say, just don't play Alva. She is an incredibly weak unit. And so that's it for the standards, which means we can go straight into the welfare units now. And once again, we'll start on Ramona as the most special one. And today, it's going to be G Ramona this time. Fancy little transformation there. And what G Ramona does is that she is a much more complicated kit than the original Ramona. You'll notice that all of this basically has double the amount of text. And she has her own unique mechanic called Negantropy, which is basically she charges up a status on you that doesn't do anything until it hits 3. And when it hits 3, her card, one of her cards gets a bonus effect until you play it, and then it resets the charge. So if you want to get most value off Ramona cards, G Ramona cards, you really want to have this Rouse, because the Rouse will give you more stacks of the buff, basically. Because it will give you a stack whenever you play one of her cards. As far as the effects themselves, you have her Sight Unbound, which is going to draw you a card from your draw pile and reduce cost by 1. Or, if you have that loop effect, the Negantropy max stack, which is called loop, you can fetch any card in your discard or draw pile, and it'll cost 0. So normally you're going to use it for that. You're going to use it to grab a card from the discard. Or if you're running her with a, like, Hath or someone, just to find that Hyper Flare that you've been looking for the whole game, right? Her Strike will give her more damage when it's looped, and her defense will reduce damage as well as draw a card when it's looped. So these are also these really powerful effects to loop and are just generally strong. And that just leaves us with her Exalt and her 3-cost card. I will get into 3-cost card in a second because it's actually really interesting. But her Exalt is really weird. She places the last 3 cards you played from the previous turn. So if you want to Exalt with her, you want to remember what the last 3 cards you played last turn was. And it's only non-derived cards, it says, which is basically anything that starts in your deck. It's not like it's going to be a Caster Plume. A Caster Plume, for example, is a derived card. A Gland, for example, is a derived card usually. Corpora's Pilots are like the perfect example of a derived card. She's not going to give you those cards back. She's going to give you like the normal cards back. And Gland Division is technically not a derived card. That's why it was a bad example, which I apologize for. So, but she gives them to you at -1 cost, and then they will both discard, and they'll be deleted if you play them or if you try to discard them, basically. So you really do want to play them right away. But it also replaces your current posse with one you've unlocked, and unless you end the fight, you basically have to use that posse eventually. It will return back to your normal posse if you don't, but yeah. There is a way of getting around this though, and it's simply that you can just pick your posse that you already have equipped, and that way it doesn't really do anything. But it can be nice to, if you just like say need weakness right away, and you don't have a weakness source, you can collect the voices in your head posse, or if you're not running like Mouse Wisdom, you can use it to get +3 Aerith that turn. So it does have a lot of utility, but a pretty simple way of using it is just to pick your current posse again, because it doesn't do anything when it does that, and that way it's not overwriting what you currently use. So now we have a predetermined strike, and our predetermined strike is really cool. I really like a predetermined strike. So a minor thing about Ramona's original Queen Sword card in the normal base form is that every time you play it, it does get +1 attack. I think it caps out at like 7 or so, but when you play it, it's +1 attack. Predetermined strike is similar. The posse, every time you posse, she gets a 1-time strength multiplier on her predetermined strike. So if you posse like 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 times in your fight, and it's only for the fight, but if you posse like 20 times in a fight, that's a 20 times strength multiplier. And this predetermined strike is just going to be doing so much damage then. And its loop effect is that it can exhaust itself or basically refund itself. So both of these are solid, but you do only want to do the exhaust because it will do double damage when you're trying to kill with it. And these natures of this card makes G Ramona a potential DPS, which is really cool. And so if you lack a DPS, then you can use G Ramona. Because G Ramona is actually a character you can unlock after Chapter 2, I'm told. Even though I unlocked her way later. But you can unlock her after Chapter 2. With just if you complete her story and 60 standard pulls. And so in that case, she is, in a sense, a welfare unit. Somewhere between half welfare, half limited. I mean, not limited, standard. And then these are the actual 3 welfare units. Ogier, Lotan, Doll. And first things first, I should say about them, is as the investigation badge welfare units, you get 2 of them each month. And you should always, and I mean always, wait to use them until they have their overexalt. They are just very weak characters otherwise. Doll is a very quick kit I will explain for her. She has this card, which applies 2 stacks of weakness, and she has this card that can give you a lot of healing if you're low. Okay, cool. And her exalt also cleanses vulnerable state. Cool. Anyways, unless you need that 2 turns of weakness for whatever reason, you're not putting Doll into a team. The only time you're running Doll in your team is a D-Tide and you ran out of other units. She is a very, very, very weak Awaker. But 2 turns of weakness for 2 costs is not a bad effect. But you have to make sure she's up to OE at the very least. Lotan is a much more complicated unit than her. And so I won't go into the details of the Enlightens because you always want to get her up to Overexalt. But basically, this Overexalt gives her a lot of damage for the fight and does a lot of damage to the boss. And then you just play strikes with her. You play the Tides of Hubris, you play the Blades of Defiance, and you just get more and more damage, and her Exalt and all that just clears mobs very easily. So she's a complicated character compared to Doll, who you only care about applying a debuff. But really all she is you play strikes to reduce this Blade of Defiance. You play the Blade of Defiance to do damage. Every time you do damage, you just have more damage, and you really want to just be Exalt spamming on her as well. Especially that Overexalt into boss fights. I don't recommend saving the Overexalt outside of boss fights, like trying to use it outside of boss fights or elite fights. Use it in the elite and boss fights, otherwise the normal Exalt will do fine for clearing mobs. And then Ogier is a strength stacking shielder. You really only use him for a couple reasons. One is Exalt gives you temporary strength and shield. So it's just a nice simple button to have on your team. It's very similar to Goliath and Tulu I've described in the previous video, where it's just a nice little bonus to on your burst turn that can be applied. And then other than that, you really just like him because he has a 2 cost that applies vulnerable. Once again, applying debuffs, always good. And he has a free shield. The free shield is usually very weak. For example, mine only applies 19 shield when it's played for free. But you really just want him for his Exalt that can give you shield and strength. And even sometimes the Fragile Cleanse is relevant. But it's mostly for just the strength and the vulnerable. And so that's all for the welfares. And we're going to actually start from going bottom up for the limited. So that means we're going to start with Lily. And Lily is a poison shielder. So Lily has a lot of shielding and healing that she can do because she has this mechanic called Endure, which is whenever she takes damage, she gets an Endure stack. And then the Endure stacks have different effects. So when you play her, you use it with your Exalt, you can restore 10% of your 10% of the HP you've lost basically as Endure stacks. And then if you have her over Exalt, you can get basically much, much more healing from that. And we'll also give you 2 of her 4-cost card that has Prepare. So that's also good. I'll explain what that does in a second. And then you really do want the E3 at the very least, but OE is also really nice. And you want her at E3 because then it turns into a true shielder, a true highly defensive unit, because her 4-cost card can remove your Endure stack, so you don't get the heal off of it anymore. But with this E3, that's no longer an issue. Plus, you get way more Endure stack generation. So if you want to play Lily, I recommend getting her up to E3. It feels very miserable for me that I don't have her that. Other notable things is that she skills with death resistance, especially on her defense card. You'll notice she just gains more shield on this for each point of defense you have, of death resistance you have. So that's really, really powerful. And then, so I said she was a poison shielder earlier as well. Strike to Protect will trigger 100% of an enemy's poison if it crits. Only 50% if it doesn't, admittedly. But you can trigger a lot of the poison proc on it, and because this card has Prepare, you can just hold on to it until it costs 0. So those are all really nice effects for her. But basically, what she is just this very powerful defensive unit. Used to be one of the best shielders in the game. Now she's been overdone by Caster and Kath, but she's still a top tier shielder. And you just want to use her as this very powerful, very defensive unit, especially in poison teams. And now we have everyone's favorite furry, Riker. And Riker's a bit interesting with the Enlightens, because his Overexalt is really powerful. It reduces all the cards you draw from it by 1, and so in Arc 1, where you have infinite card playability as long as you have the era to afford it, having a bunch of 0-cost cards in hand can be very, very, very good. And obviously just reducing card costs in general is very, very, very good. But it's getting all the way up to OE. It can be very difficult for him, so it's really not that important. His E3 is also really cool, because you can basically play his strikes and defenses for free, but admittedly also doesn't matter. It also gives him a little bit more damage, but Riker doesn't do damage. Riker is a draw and strength stacking support. What you really care about is his E2. Because Riker, his mechanic, his special mechanic, that's very unique to Riker, and it's in his talents page, I believe. Yeah. Is that you can choose one of 3 relics. There's a relic that gives you 10% crit rate and fixes his die rolls. You can get a relic that gives you a dice every time that you posse. And then there's a relic that increases the crit rate and crit damage up to 30% for crit damage and 10% for crit rate. If you've played enough of his cards and rolled enough dice. And the way you do that is by getting enough money. This is 75, 150, 300 Black Sigil breakpoints, basically. If you get this much money, you get each relic. And you get to choose, which is really nice. Because that's his whole mechanic. His whole mechanic is rolling dice. His Exalt rolls the dice to determine how many cards you draw. His Showdown rolls the dice to determine how many times it hits. The Showdown also will give you a lot of Alien Miss if it rolls high, and will give you a decent amount of Alien Miss if it rolls low. If it rolls a 1, for example, unlucky, but it'll still give you, at level 5 for me, 14 Alien Miss, which is solid, right? For comparison's sake, uh, Kaikis gives you 20 Alien Miss when you play his 2 costs. So it just needs and because the Showdown gets better for every dice you roll, it only takes like a 3 or a 4 on a die, so a very average roll literally to perform equally to or outperform the same cost card on a Kaikis, for example. And then his unexpected, and the reason why you very much need his Enlighten one is E2 is very important for his power because it gives him more money for all those relics, but his most important power spike of all of them is his E1 because it makes it that his unexpected gain card, his 1 cost card, which allows you to draw a card from your deck when you play it, it can reduce the card's cost by 2. So that will make most cards free or close to free. But that is only if you crit. Riker. Riker, you really, really, really care about crit rate more than anything else. Sigil yield is important. Crit rate is more important. If you can get Riker up to 100% crit rate in a run by like getting one of the crit rate relics or just having a good investment into him, he can be a very, very powerful unit with how easy it is to draw good cards. And since this is meant to be more of a new player guide, I will explain how the dice work. He generates a card called Octahedron Dice when you get the 1 relic that generates dice. And if you roll a 4 or higher on it, it gives the enemies weak vuln, and it will increase your strength no matter what you roll. His Rouse allows you to upgrade one of your 3 relics that you've picked up throughout that run from him. Instead of having a 10% crit rate and on the relic, it will give you 15% crit rate, and you get the bonus effect that your dice rolls will always be +1, which means since a dice normally rolls up to 6, it can actually roll up to 7, and if it rolls to 7, it will give the enemy weakness and vuln instead, which is really, really cool. There is upgrading the dice relic, the one that gives you the dice, and what that will do is make the dice effect stronger. You won't be gaining like double stacks of vuln or anything, but the strength gains will be much higher. And if you roll a 6, it now also applies a +1 Aerith for you. And so if you have both, it can be very good effect. But you don't realistically get +2 upgraded relics. You can only get 2 upgraded relics in Arc 2, basically. And that is if you have a high sigil gain team. And then the last one just increases the caps on the crit rate and crit damage to... Crit rate is going to be about 20%, and crit damage is 50%. Which is good, but is arguably the least powerful of the effects. Generally speaking, if you're going to upgrade one, it's going to be the dice relic, because you can... Just having more power on the dice is really strong. And so, next is going to be Hamlin. And the devs don't know what Hamlin is. The devs think Hamlin is like this DPS, but he's not a DPS. He is a support. You see that? Chorus. Chorus means support. He is a support. And what he does is has one of the best exalts in the game. It has a bunch of effects that no one cares about, and it allows you to double play a card. That's the main thing. You get a temporary buff on a card that will allow you to double play it. I say temporary only because the buff goes away when you either A, end a fight. Basically everything in this game, it gets reset after you end a fight. And then... Or once you play the card. So once you get that first double play trigger, then that's it for the fight. But that first double play trigger is very good, and you can't reapply the Exalt onto the same card. That's what makes it a temporary in my mind. But double playing cards is just generally very powerful effect. And also, once you get them up to Enlightened 2, that double play effect also reduces the cost card by 2. So if you're running like a Dorisane with his Dirges, right, that are these very powerful 3-cost cards, you can reduce them down to 1 cost and get a double played, which is very, very powerful because Dorsane's this burst character. You just really want that. If you have to wheel, you put it onto the pinions. The pinion of time now costs 0 and it generates 2 insights. It's insane power there because you're going +2 Aerith effectively. And also generating 2 wings for to wheel and all that blah 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 blah. I'm just saying that because these are very powerful effects. And if you're playing Gela, who's like even one of the weaker ones, you're just straight up double playing a flail. And just straight up double playing a flail that you've generated is very powerful as well. So this Exalt has a lot of utility and is a very, very powerful effect. One of the most powerful effects in the game, really, if you think about it. And the last thing you can really do with it that can be impressive is no matter what team he's on, you can at least exalt his Memory Rondo. And his Memory Rondo is a card that gives you some strength and also gives you 2 insights. And so if you exalt it, it will give you 4 insights and some strength. And insights, obviously, are very, very powerful cards. And I've mentioned them a couple times now. I guess I should explain at least what they do just in case. But they are a card that is a 0-cost state card, they're called, that will give you 1 Aerith and 1 draw when played, and they also have Retain, so they can sit in your hand for as long as you need them. Very powerful effects. And not only that, but if you don't have E2 Hamlin, right, if you have E0 Hamlin, and you still want to play the Memory Rondo for Insights, you can at any point, because the Memory Rondo can be played for literally for free. If you play the Memory Rondo for free, the effect changes from adding the insights to hand to adding them to your draw pile. Adds them to your deck, basically. So it can be very powerful to just play that Memory Rondo for free, because it is just a very good free card. The rest of his kit, legitimately, well, that's not true. The rest of his cards don't matter. His Rouse itself can be very powerful as well, because his Rouse, when played, for each turn onward, it will give you a 0-cost card that gives you the option of either increasing the cost of a card by 2 and double playing it. So, very similar to his Exalt, except for this time it's taxing you instead of cheapening it. Or you can just make cards cost you less. So, that Symphony, it's called Symphonies. And whichever Symphony you choose, whether make it card more expensive to play it more, or what's probably going to use it more commonly to make a card cheaper, it can be very powerful as well. So that's why these 2/3 costs, his Rouse and his Memory are both very powerful cards. The Soul Overture is a very good source of sigil on your teams. If you're in Arc 1, you get plus 50 sigil by selling this, and I very much recommend you do. But overall, just a very powerful support for your teams. Would recommend him for basically any Chaos support team, almost. And I'm going to skip up to Jeetal, because that will just leave us with 3 DPS to talk about. But Jeetal is a really cool unit. And annoyingly, everyone will tell you that she needs Overexalt. Everyone will tell you that she needs Overexalt to be a character, blah, 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 blah. That is not technically true. I will say, she hides a lot of her power behind the Overexalt, but technically, person watching this video, do not need her at OE. You don't need her at +4. You just need to get this one Enlighten. You just need this one Enlighten because it gives her 2-cost card that's giving you the choice of applying Vuln or Weakness to enemies. And as I've mentioned before, debuffs are always good. Debuffs are always good. So the Self-Destruct will give a turn of Vuln or Weakness on enemies depending on what you need. And that is just a very powerful effect to gain. That is if you don't have Red OE. if you do get her up to Overexalt, she basically all her effects become way stronger. Literally everything she does becomes way better. That's just it. That's why you want her at Overexalt, really, is because everything she does gets stronger when you have her at Overexalt. But as far as what her effects are, is that she has this 3-cost card that will give her Aliamus and heal you for the amount of Aliamus you have on your team. It's basically every 50 breakpoint. So the ideal timing to play it is around the time where most of your characters have like 50 or more Aliamus, because that will give you the most healing. Her self-destruct I just went over, and then her rouse gives you Aliamus and healing every turn. And obviously that's really good. And then all else that matters is that her Exalt gives the team Aliamus. And also damage amplification temporarily. So you can Exalt on your burst turn to, one, charge up Exalts, but also to increase the damage you're doing. And that is what has earned her the position as a battery character. I believe she is... Yeah, she's the second battery unit I've discussed in these videos outside of Miriam. Base Doll is also technically a battery unit, but her Aliamus gain numbers are so bad. All Wickers gain 70 right now at this level. It's, well, 7 I should say at this level. Just the numbers are really bad on her. She's a very weak Aliamus gen unit, so that's why no one really talks about her like that. G-Doll, on the other hand, is very good at giving Aliamus, especially at her OE, because it doubles the Aliamus that she provides. And then you'll notice that I haven't said a lot for how much text is on these cards, because she also has a secondary form called the Finale form. And this Finale form is generated by being in a boss fight. While you're in a boss fight, you get 1 stack of Finale, basically, every turn, and then you get a stack every time you Exalt. And so normally, you only get up to Finale after 5 turns if you Exalt every turn. If you don't have her at OE, her Overexalt allows you to get that faster because it will give you 2 stacks of Finale when she uses her Exalt instead of just 1 if you use her Overexalt. Which means you can theoretically very easily get up to it in 3 turns. Or really 4, but you know. And when you do get to that 10th point, whether you have regular Exalt or Overexalt, it gives you a 0-cost card in hand called the Finale that normally does 25% of the target's HP. It does 25% fixed damage to an enemy. However, if you are planning on getting to that point with G-Doll, if you're just planning on having fights go long enough to get to that point, and whether you're playing like a really long fight, for example, like chapters 8, 7, or 9 bosses, or, you know, other powerful enemies, you're really going to want her to have E3. If you want her on your team and you're doing those long boss fights, you really want her at E3. Because it increases that card's effect by 5% damage, and also adds an additional 30% HP recovery. The heal is the important part. If you are expecting a fight to go that long, you are expecting a fight where you're losing a lot of HP, and this heal can very much like make or break a run. I was coaching someone who was playing a Blue Will, who was playing it E2 to wheel and E2 G-Doll, and that was what was destroying us. We almost lost the run. We almost lost against Chapter 9 boss because we didn't have the extra healing that those Enlightens provide. We ended up winning anyways, but it was if we had access to those effects, it would not have even been close. But once she has played that card, her cards do transform. So her 3-cost card, instead of healing you, now will apply a lot of poison on the enemy. And it's the same effect where it's prerogative that you have Alien Mist on your other characters for so the more Alien Mist the better for applying the poison. Her 2-cost card will now apply both the Vuln or weakness effect. Well, both Vuln and instead of Vuln or. So the 2 costs normally get a choice of weakness and Vuln, and it just will do both. It will, however, cost you 10% of your max HP when you play it. There is a trade-off there, unfortunately. That's why I try to avoid playing the 2 costs once you've transformed. And she also, at that point, no longer needs to over-exalt, because her exalt effect then changed to draw 3 cards and obtain 3 Aerith. So after that point, every time you draw with her, you get also every time you exalt with her, not only are you getting the alien mist and stuff, you are also getting 3 cards and gaining 3 Aerith. Very, very powerful effect. And so Jidal really shines in poison comps as well, because when she has transformed, she applies a lot of poison and can trigger poison damage as well. And speaking of poison comps, that brings us to 24. And I will be very brief with this character, and then make a full 24 guide in the future. But I will simply explain that this character, you very much need her to get her first Enlighten, because that will allow her Frenzy Slash to actually do damage. And you really need her to get up to her second Enlighten, because that allows you to apply weakness and vuln on all enemies. Now, as far as her kit herself, all you need to know for now is that these details change with each realm she's in. It does something different if you're in A-Core, if you're in Chaos, if you're in like pure Chaos, if you're in Ultra, or if you're in Karo. But what doesn't change is that her 3-cost card does damage. Her 2-cost card also does damage and applies debuffs. And her Exalt switches between a not so damaging mode and then a more aggressive damaging mode. And for now, that's all I'm going to have to leave you with. Just know that she is a very powerful DPS option in all your colors. And in another video, I will explain in detail all her different combinations. And now we're at... Let's actually skip Cath. For now, we are on Tawil. Tawil is my favorite character that's currently in the game. You'll notice I have her basically maxed out. The only thing she's missing is 2 Alien Mist talents. She's missing plus 10 Alien Mist at the start of a fight. Otherwise, this character is fully maxed out. And why is that? Because she does everything. Literally everything. So, her Rouse will add a card everyone calls the Silver Key card into your hand. And what that does is that it allows you to select a posse, and it will play that posse twice. And it's only posses you unlocked, but, it's 2 posses for the turn, right? It's double Mouse Wisdom. It's double Festival Ties to draw 2 cards and gain 4, or draw 4 cards and gain 4 Aerith. It's double Voices to apply 2 stacks of Weakness and Volt for it, It's a very, very, very powerful effect. And it also makes it that every time you play one of her cards, it gains 1.5 times the key flare that it would normally generate. And so that is important because this character cares very much about key flare. She cares about posseing. She cares about all that, right? And before I go into greater detail of all that and why, I should first explain what her Enlightens do. So, I'll say this now. She can be played at almost any Enlighten. Her E1, though, is judged by the community to be her minimum Enlightenment. Because her E1 makes it that when you play her Pinion of Time, which is her most important card in her kit, it gives you an insight And so it allows you to continue playing cards that turn. Otherwise, you're basically taking a turn off to play the Pinion. So if you are a new player and you have one copy of Tuil, she can be very nice for those early chapters where you don't need this. But if you do want to play her in later content, you're at the very minimum going to require this Enlighten. And then the other one just reduces the cost of one of her cards. That I will explain in detail how it works later, but it's not super relevant. It is just nice to have. The other effect is way more important. Her second Enlighten gives it that cards she generates with her Exalt gain Prepare instead of just having Retain. And that is very important for a lot of her power in very later stages. I'm talking like Chapter 7, 8, 9, Arc 2 type content. Because it just allows you to play these very powerful cards more easily. And so a lot of players will say that she's an E2 or bust character. She really only requires the E1, but the E2 is a nice little power spike. And now most players will say her E3 is useless. Because it gives her strikes and defense increased crit rate, crit damage for her when you play them. But that's not why her E3 is valuable to me. I think her E3 is actually incredibly valuable for certain fights, and it's because of the second line of text, where it places a card called Echoes of the Past into hand when triggering death resistance. So, when you're triggering death resistance, you're basically surviving a hit that would have killed you, and it's leaving you at 1 life. But Echoes of the Past will put you to whatever life you ended the last turn with. And so, if you're getting one-shot by an attack, this will put you all the way back to full health. And in some very late fights, where you are basically guaranteed to trigger death resistance, especially when it's your first time going through, this can just very easily save your run because it's another heal. That's why I said with the G-Doll, those two powerful heal effects are really nice. And so what does her kit do, right? It is a Key Flare, right? When she exalts. But more importantly, you get to look at 5 cards from her, whatever realm she's in right now, and you get to put them into your hand. So, specifically, it's the non-chaos cards, unless you're in pure chaos, so running 4 chaos units. But she'll give you like blue cards, she'll give you red cards, she'll give you purple cards, depending on what realm she's in. And that is why you really like to pair her with blue. There's one other reason, but the main reason why you really like to play her with blue is because blue cards, pound for pound, just have the strongest effects. Like, generally speaking, blue cards are just the most powerful. Chaos has some also powerful cards, but they're much fewer and far between. Karo Red has very few powerful cards. There are a couple, but the card quality in Karo is extremely low. And then the last one, Ultra, all the card effects are relatively weak or mid. It's not that you are gonna not pick cards up in Ultra as opposed to Karo, which you will just skip cards all the time. But the cards aren't really that powerful. So that's why blue or mono are her best combinations. Mono for other reasons, but blue because the cards are so powerful. Now, her cards that you actually care about, though, is this Pinion of Time, right? Because it adds a card called Twin Wings into your deck. And when you do the Exalt, your next card you play will be double played, and most of the time you're going to want it to be this Pinion. You're going to want it to be this card. Right here. Because then you're adding 2 wings and 2 insights to hand. It's just a very powerful effect. And so what do the Twin Wings do that you're shuffling? Well, it gives her back Aliamus, for one. So you're getting to play more cards. And it also hits the enemy twice. and twice as big. That also is the reason why you want her in blue. Because in blue, if you go into red tentacle stance, because blue has 3 tentacle stances. If you go into red tentacle stance and play a damaging card, it will trigger a tentacle swing, and it's per hit. So it's 2 hits, which means 2 tentacle swings. And then you'll see it also shuffles a 4-wing into your deck. So not only are you playing this Insight Opinion that generates the Twin Wing, it generates another card called the 4-wing. And the 4-wing generates a lot of damage. You can't read it here, but what the 4-wing does is that it hits 4 times. And so with tentacles, that's 4 hits. And it also will generate temporary strength for you and lower the strength of the enemy. So you're going into multi-hit enemy. 4-wing cards will, in general, just reduce a lot of damage when you're playing them. But they also will give you a lot of damage. That's a lot of where Two-Wheel's power comes from, is playing like 3 or 4 4-wings in a single turn will give you a lot of damage. Now, they all cost 2. So you may be asking me, how do you plan on having me play 4 4-wings in a turn? They cost 2 Aerith. I can only play 2 max. Tweel's wings can be played with Keyflare. Tweel's wings basically can be played with your Posse Bar. That is one of the reasons why it is so significant to have the wings. That is important. That is so important. Why she generates Keyflare is really important, because the more Keyflare you have, basically, is the more wings you get to play. And after you play that 4-wings, she isn't done, right? It's not the 4-wings and done. You get a 6-wing. You'll never guess how many times that hits. But you have that 6-wing. You're hitting 6 times with the tentacles. That's 6 hits. You just do a lot of damage with that. But there's a lot of important uses about the 6-wings. One, the 6-wing pierces. Pierce being the effect that gets around invulnerability states, so it can do a lot of damage to things like Awakener bosses. And in fact, I have multiple showcases to people, and even a couple on my channel, of literally just devouring through it, and if not one-shotting an Awakener boss, pushing them to the point where they are very close to being one-shot. And if they're below 15% health, they've effectively been one-shot, because when you're playing through story, you have been given these very powerful cards as like your chapter mechanic. You know, you're given cards that generates you Alien Mist, given cards that give you barrier per turn, or etc., etc. And Tweel basically allows you to select one of these effects once per run when you play the 6-wing. After you play a 6-wing, you're given a choice of like 7 options. And it's these powerful effects from across the chapters in the game. And it's best to save them for the boss fight, because each of them can only be used once. But it's barrier, it's draw, it's card selection, it's everything you want it, basically. It's all of just the best effects from throughout the runs. And you'll know when to use them. And you'll want to use them in the boss fight, because it'll just be more powerful in the boss fight. And now for why people want her at OE. Why Tweel is one of the best DPS in the game once you get her up to OE. Her damage, her shielding, and her healing per the turn gets increased by 35% when you OE, when you overexalt. So just that is already huge. However, the 5 card selection from her exile I mentioned earlier becomes 10. So you get to look at double the cards, which is double the chances of getting good cards. And you get plus 3 arithmetica for that turn as well. So you go from 5 Aerith to 8 Aerith. You go from 5 cards to 10 cards. You can only pick 3 still, but you go from 5 cards to 10 cards. And you get 35% increased damage, basically. You want this character to overexalt. You eventually, at least, want to get this character up to overexalt. She's extremely powerful. And All that's left is Kath, the newest addition to the Chaos roster. And I'm checking to make sure, but outside of G-Doll, the only Arc 2 one. So I guess I should mention Riker, Hamlin, Tawil, and Lily, all being added to Standard Chaos Banner come Anniversary. G-Doll isn't. G-Doll's unique, but you will be able to pull for her during Anniversary. And then Kath, also, for same as G-Doll. And Kath's mechanic is called Fiamma. Kath is somewhat simple in her design, but complicated in her play patterns. If you're bad at counting, her entire play pattern really is just about manipulating her Fiamma stacks and counting math. And so the important thing you need to know with her is that you want her at E3. You want her third Enlighten, because when you have her third Enlighten, you are starting the battle with a 1 second Fiamma on all her cards, and that is basically mandatory for the character's kit to function. Because what she does is that you can stack up to 3 Fiamma stacks onto a card, and the way that you do that by is either playing a card that has a Fiamma stack on it, because it will bounce to another card. It will specifically only bounce one. So if you have a card with 2 Fiamma stacks on it, or 3, you'll only be gaining 1 Fiamma stack back, but that is how you basically maintain your Fiamma stacks, and why it's important to start with Fiamma stacks, to have that bouncing around, because you want to play more Fiamma stacks. I'll explain why in a minute. And for each Fiamma stack on one of her cards, it gets empowered. So her defense gains more shielding, her last stand does more damage, her strike does more damage, and her strength and defense will also gain her more Aliamus, which will allow her to Exalt to draw her cards and apply Fiamma stacks, because that's what her Exalt does, by the way. Her Exalt is you draw 2 of her cards and it gets Fiamma stacks. The rest of the text doesn't really matter. And all this because you want to get her up to 10 Fiamma stacks. Why 10? Because then her Solar Flare transforms. When it transforms, it becomes a card called Hyper Flare. And what the Hyper Flare is a card that just does a lot of damage. That, simply put, it's just an Exhaust card that does a lot of damage, especially if you have Fiamma stacks on it, if you have Flame stacks on it. And so all you're really trying to do each time you play Kath is build up Fiamma stacks into a Hyper Flare and then play this Hyper Flare, which is just this big AoE attack. And another aspect of why her Enlighten 3 is so important and why it makes or breaks the character is because you also, for each flame stack you gain throughout the fight, increases her damage. And so this is what gives her scaling. If you don't have that, she doesn't have any scaling, and she doesn't do any damage, right? And so not only is she incredibly slow, but she doesn't have any scaling at that point. But that really is just Kath. She's just, you play Kath cards, you do big damage. You are just trying to bounce around these flame stacks to get it up to 3, to get these big, powerful flame stack effects, and you to get the Hyper Flare to just burn, quote unquote, all your enemies to the ground. And she synergizes very well with the wheels that add cards into your deck. I will actually just showcase some of them for now. Her basically best in slot wheels are things like this right here, the Land of Non-Existence, because it adds a defense to the deck and increases defenses. And so you want this on her because you're getting a lot of shield when you play your defense. And you also want more Fiamma cards in your deck, so this is really good. And then she also sees a lot of play with Will Unyielding right here, because it adds a strike and a defense to the deck, and that's really good. Because those will also have the Fiamma, so those are the kind of wheels you want to put on her. But it only works with wheels. You don't want to put Dreams of Medicine, which is the similar Covenant that does that, because it doesn't work with the Covenants, it only works with wheels. But that is it for Chaos. It is the largest realm, so hopefully this was the longest video. And I do hope I provided a suitable explanation to basically why Awakers are good, why they see play, and simply how to use them. I did not provide any team advice for you guys, but that is really up to you all to figure out. That is what I think is interesting about it, is that, and about this game in general, is that you can come up with the combinations on your own. You know, I just want to give you all an understanding of what people use them for, how a lot of their cards work, what basically where does the power come from? Why pick said character? And I believe I have done a suitable job of this in this video. And if you managed to watch all the way to the end, I thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed.